Chapter 5 of A Diamond in the Rough by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, in which Fred King is charged with a serious crime. The glare of the fire grew brighter as Fred approached the entrance to the wood. Some house in the village was evidently in flames. A moment later he dashed out clear of the trees, and his first glance at a familiar locality assured him that it was John Marsh's cottage that was burning. "Good gracious!" exclaimed the boy. "This is rough on Marsh." Anxious to be on the scene of trouble as soon as he could, Fred cut across the by-lane, and before he knew what was in his way had stumbled over the crouching figure of a man. "Blast you! Can't you see where you're going?" "Jake Wise!" exclaimed Fred in surprise. "You know me, do you?" snarled the cracker boss, rising to his feet and laying hold of King. "Where are you running to, you little imp?" "John Marsh's house is on fire, and I'm going to go see if I can't help put it out." Jake Wise turned his head in the direction of the flames, and then Fred noticed another figure snuggling down in the gloom. It was Gummit, the Englishman. "What are you doing out here this hour of the morning?" asked Wise with a wicked look in his eyes. "Don't you know you ought to be in bed?" "I've been in the Wilkes-Barre and only just got back," said Fred, struggling to release himself. "Hold hard, I think you're lying. I believe you sought fire to Marsh's house yourself. It's my opinion you ain't none too good for that kind of work. What do you think, Gummit?" "I shouldn't be surprised if he had," coincided the landlord of the miners' retreat, who detected the drift of Wise's scheme. "What do you mean?" gasped Fred, amazed at such an accusation. "I mean just what I say. Ain't we catched you running away from the fire?" "Running away from it? Running toward it, you mean?" "Come now, that won't wash, will it, Gummit?" "I should think not," replied Gummit, coming forward. "You seen which way he was running, didn't you?" "I did." "So you see, young feller, you're catched in the act. Come along." "Let me go, will you?" cried Fred in desperate earnestness. "We couldn't think of it," said Gummit, laying his hand on the boy's other arm. "We're going to take you to the lockup." "I believe you set fire to the house yourselves," ejaculated Fred angrily. "The idea!" cried Gummit with a look of virtuous indignation. "Did you hear that, Wise?" "You little imp!" roared Jake, giving his prisoner a rough shake which loosened Gummit's grip. At the same moment Fred gave a sudden tug and tore himself away from Wise. "Grab him, Gummit!" The Englishman tried to, but Fred, like an eel, wriggled out of reach and was off toward the burning cottage like a shot. "He's got away," said Gummit in a tone of disappointment. "Well, let him go. We'll throw suspicion on him anyway, saying we seen him running from the fire." "All right. And we can say that he changed his plan when he seen he was discovered and ran back again to pretend he just come to help." "That's right. We'll have to go to the fire ourselves now, or it wouldn't look well." So the two rascals started on a jog trot for John Marsh's cottage. Quite a number of miners had reached the scene of the fire by the time Fred arrived. They were only half dressed, and many of them had brought buckets, and a chain was hastily formed to pass the buckets full of water from the well to the flames. Of course, John Marsh and his wife had been aroused, and both were outside. "Where's Annie?" asked Mrs. Marsh anxiously, looking around and failing to see her daughter. As if in answer to her question, the window of a room in the rear attic was thrown open, and the girl's head appeared at the opening. Mrs. Marsh uttered a scream, and well she might, for it was in this wing of the cottage that the fire had started, and from the looks of things Annie was cut off by the flames from escape by the narrow stairway inside, which led to the second floor and her parents' sleeping room. A big, strapping miner who was directing the bucket brigade called for a ladder, but it happened unfortunately that there was no ladder about the premises. "Father!" screamed Annie. "Save me!" Mrs. Marsh had been detained from rushing into the cottage, but now her husband made an attempt to rescue his child in the same way. This was clearly impossible as the case stood, and he found that fact out when he reached the entry on the second floor. The place was filled with a dense smoke through which he found it impossible to force his way, and he thrust his head out of the nearest window to get air. Amid this scene of wild excitement, added to every moment by fresh arrivals from the various houses, only one person had the ready wit to see a way to save Annie Marsh. That one was Fred King. He noticed that the stout oak tree which grew a few yards from the cottage threw one of its sheltering limbs high above the window where the terrified girl, surrounded by the gathering smoke, her form thrown into bold relief by the glare of the flames in the room behind her, stood, begging in piteous accents to be saved. No one observed him shin up the gnarled trunk of the tree, work his way upward along the limbs, and make his way carefully out that particular branch which swayed and bent under his weight, until a shout of encouragement from him drew Annie's eyes upward, and her little cry of surprise as she saw him coming out toward her attracted the attention of the crowd below. As soon as his object was understood, it was immediately appreciated, and a shout went up from the spectators as well as from the perspiring neighbors who were passing buckets with great zeal. The farther out Fred progressed, the lower bent the limb of the oak, until the boy, anchoring his legs around the branch, extended his hands to the girl. "Stand up on the sill, Annie, and hold on by the side of the window jamb. That's right. Now, steady yourself so I can catch you under the arms." He grabbed her and swung her out into midair. "Don't be frightened," he said encouragingly. "Grasp hold of the tree under my neck. All right. Now, do you think you can hold on for a moment by yourself while I shift myself backward?" "Yes," replied Annie bravely. "There's no danger if you just hold on," he said. Then he released her, and she swung by her own grip over 30 feet up in the air. He worked himself backward a foot or so, and then grasped her under the arms once more. "Now let go," he said. She did so. He swung her the same relative distance as he had retreated, and then told her to grab hold of the branch again. This plan was repeated again and again until Fred had got Annie well into the body of the oak tree, when he was able to pull her up beside himself. There they rested a while to recover from their exertions. Telling Annie to hold tightly to her seat, Fred clambered nimbly down and called for a blanket to put around the girl, who was only attired in her nightdress. The article was soon got from the cottage, for the fire, now under control, had not reached the main part of the building. In a short time Fred assisted Annie to reach the ground, where her mother was waiting to receive her, deeply grateful for her daughter's escape. As the women folks gathered around the rescued miss, as is usual in such a case, King rushed away to make himself useful in putting the finishing touches to the end of the fire. "You're a nervy young fellow," said a big miner admiringly to the boy. "I'll bet he is," echoed another. "And not one of us thought of doing such a thing for the poor girl," said a third. "She'd have been burnt to death but for you," remarked a fourth. "For her room and the room underneath are completely gutted by the flames." Other miners had their say too, for all admired bravery, however shown, whether above or below the ground. Fred was quite overpowered by the praise showered indiscriminately upon him, and protested he had only done his duty as he saw it. "That's all right," said the big miner, "but you're the only one to do it at the critical moment. You ought to have a medal. What do you say, boys?" "Aye, aye," was the unanimous verdict of all within hearing. The last spark was extinguished, and although the loss was considerable, the cottage was practically saved. The crowd was gazing on the ruined wing of the pretty house and speculating as to the amount of the loss, which all supposed to be covered by the insurance, when Jake Wise and Gummit, who had left the scene a short time before, reappeared with Mr. Jinks, the constable. "There he is," said Wise, pointing. Jinks immediately walked up to Fred King, and, putting his hand on his shoulder, said, to the great surprise of all present, "Young man, I arrest you for setting fire to this cottage." End of chapter 5.